I thought I'd try to tackle another review today, and that is going to be of Thelonious Monk's music. So if you watched my last video, I did hold this up. I was kind of just talking about some new arrivals was really what I was highlighting, and I didn't talk about this release in any detail, but I wanted to cover it for really a couple of reasons. One is that I've been thinking a lot about Riverside Records recently because I co-hosted a radio show and the subject was entirely on Riverside Records. We actually played a few selections from this. I think Ruby My Dear, maybe Epistrophe, I'm trying to remember. But the other reason is because, well, you know, this is a new release, but it's also a little bit controversial because of the stereo presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well as my thoughts on how this sounds. So first, let's talk about some of the credentials. So this album, like I said, was put out by Vinyl Me Please. You can always tell because of this obi that they include. Now, despite the fact that it was put out by Vinyl Me Please, the material is actually licensed by Craft Recordings, who I believe has not only the Prestige but the Riverside catalogs, as well as a number of variety of other catalogs. And so actually on the back of this, it says Craft Recordings, a Concord company. So I'm not sure to what extent they actually pressed this versus Vinyl Me Please did at their own. Well, I guess Vinyl Me Please's pressing plant hasn't come online, but the pressing plant that they normally use, I'm not entirely sure. But what we have here is an all analog edition. This is lacquers cut by Ryan K. Smith at Sterling Sound. It's 180 gram, and all in all is pretty high quality. I always ditch these obies, not ditch them like throw them away, because if I ever have to resell this, I know somebody's going to want it. I don't really like the obies. But what you have independent of that in terms of this cover is just really, really nice. Super high quality. You always get the VMP Classics foil stamp on the back. These things typically come, I think the monthly editions, sort of the monthly selections that they have in their subscription series, come with one of these little booklets that offer some helpful liner notes. And I would say that these are helpful as well, probably for many who aren't as familiar with this record. So the credentials, I guess, otherwise on this album, obviously you have Thelonious Monk, but this is really a star-studded cast. So you have Gigi Gryce, you have Coleman Hawkins, John Coltrane, Art Blakey, Wilbur Ware, and who did I forget? I'm sure somebody. Ray Copeland on trumpet. So really, really good lineup here, and this is just one of those classic, absolutely classic records. One of the interesting things that actually the liner notes touch on, but I was familiar a little bit with the story, is Thelonious Monk here in this radio flyer, or at least generic little cart, right? So the story behind this supposedly is that Riverside wanted Monk to sort of be pictured behind a pulpit, I think drinking whiskey or maybe with a whiskey bottle in his hand, and Monk didn't want to do that. They ended up going with the radio flyer cart. One sort of little side story or side note is, so I used to have a vintage Fiat car. There's not many shops in Atlanta that can actually work on these cars, but there's a shop that's not too far away that I guess the owner of it happened to work at a Fiat dealership in the 70s, and so it was just like a perfect fit in terms of having this vintage car worked on. So I took it to him. And the day that I was picking up my car, I don't know if it was like an oil change or what, but I had a record mailer underneath my arm, and he points at it and he says, are you a record guy? Are you a vinyl guy? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you know, my uncle used to take photos for record covers. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. Like, how did he get into that? And this guy, the owner of the shop, told me the story about how his father would go down to local, I guess, race tracks, or travel to race tracks across the country, and there would be an audio crew that would be recording the sound of cars going around the track, and his uncle was responsible for taking some of the cover photos while on site. Now, the first thing that popped into my head was that this was a Riverside photographer, somebody who worked on Riverside covers, because that was one of the very earliest things that Riverside was doing, was doing audio recordings of race cars. And so I said, did your dad or did your uncle work for Riverside Records? And he said, yeah. And I said, it was your uncle Paul Bacon? And he said, yes. And so I was like shocked, right? Because how often does my passion for jazz vinyl kind of overlap in the real world, and having these like sort of spontaneous conversations with random people? And it turns out that my car was getting worked on by the nephew of Paul Bacon. And one of the covers that he brought up specifically in that conversation was this one, was Monk sitting in the Radio Flyer cart. And that was a cover that had stuck in his mind, I guess, and rightly so, right? Because this is absolutely iconic. All right, so that's a little bit about the packaging to start. All right, so now let's talk about the stereo presentation. So put yourself in the year that this was recorded, which is 1957. Riverside was experimenting with stereo recordings. Similarly, Contemporary Records was, Blue Note was. I'm trying to think. I think Contemporary was one of the earliest, I believe, to tackle stereo and actually do it in a really nice way. Blue Note was doing it for Blue Train, and I think even I'm trying to think if Blue Train might have been actually the very first title that they did in stereo, even though it didn't come out on stereo until at least a year or two later. But in any event, Riverside was no exception. Everybody was looking at stereo, and this album was actually the very first title that Riverside put out in stereo format. And there was a little bit of a gap between them. I want to say about 9 months between when the mono recording was released and the stereo recording was released. I don't know exactly why, the reason for the gap, except for perhaps they wanted to sort of maximize the sales that they could get from each format. But this was it was interesting process for them, because Riverside actually used two different sets of microphones to record mono and stereo. The mono mics were set in front of the musicians. The stereo mics were actually suspended from the ceiling. So these musicians were essentially surrounded by microphones, because there's twice as many, really for each instrument. So there's definitely a difference between the sound of mono and stereo, and tangibly, the stereo just sounds like the microphones were placed further away from the musicians, which is probably accurate. If they're being suspended from a ceiling in one of these like tall ceilinged, sound studios, right? So they're positioned further away. There was also there's an equipment failure on the track. I'm trying to remember which one it was. But there was an equipment failure on one of the tracks that was supposed to be track 3 on side 2. And so it is present on the mono edition, and it is not present on the stereo, because they couldn't rescue it. Actually, on some reissues, even when most of the reissues in stereo, they actually add the mono version of that track back. But they didn't do that here. They actually honored the original presentation of the stereo record with this release. So it's kind of interesting that you could say Vinyl Me Please chose to release this in stereo, and it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that Kraft Recording is planning their own mono release. It could be that this was the only version that Kraft was willing to make available, or it could be that, simply put, modern audiences prefer stereo music. They're expecting to hear different things and have that kind of like soundstage, I guess, in releases. But for whatever the reason is, they did put this out in stereo. It does, again, exclude that one track, but it's only four and a half minutes, I think, for that track. So it's not like you lose that much content. There's still a lot of music here, especially because there's a couple of these tracks, I think, that clock in at over 10 minutes. So still lots of content. All right, so real quick, the one thing that I just checked that was kind of interesting is that the liner notes, even on this reissue, which means that on the original stereo, they actually reference that track that was deleted, or that wasn't able to make the album. And it's titled, I think this is how you pronounce it, Crepuscule with Nellie, which was referring to Thelonious Monk's wife. So anyway, like I said, it is not on this version. It is still referenced in the liner notes, just because I'm sure they didn't want to change the liner notes between the mono and stereo editions. So how does this sound? And I'm not going to do a formal shootout with the original, though I do have an original, but I think I can kind of do it without. So basically what you get, I've already told you kind of what you don't get. Or you don't get one of those tracks and the microphones sound like they're positioned further away from the instruments. So that is the case. So what you get, though, is clarity of sound and no noise floor. because this is a modern reissue, they actually did a really good job, I think, with what they had. In terms of, you know, some of the insufficiencies, I think, of the recording are present in the original stereo as well. And what you get, though, is no noise floor. I think that this stereo separation, and keep in mind, this is the very first one they ever did this with, is a little too obvious. It just feels a little bit too panned left versus right, although the piano does kind of have certainly an echo that bridges more towards the center, I think, between the two channels. But the horns are really pushed into a single channel. The drums have a tendency to be a little echoey, probably because the drums are on the floor, and so my guess is that the microphones are even further away, if they're being suspended from the ceiling, even further away from the drums. And so you get a little bit more of that ancillary room noise, which is not as good. There's also an audibility problem with the bass. And again, you know, where the bass is making noise, my guess is lower to the floor than if you're, say, a standing musician and you're able to position your horn somewhere. So the bass is not very audible in this recording. I think it is better in this reissue than it is in the original, but I would still say the drums and the bass are probably the biggest issues with the stereo presentation. That being said, the horns sound great. The solo piano lines especially sound great. I think it does get a little bit muddy or even a little bit distracting when you have it all layered. But, you know, in these kind of extended length pieces, there's lots of opportunities for solos, and many of those solo elements sound really, really good. So I think in conclusion, what I would say is that this is certainly a worthwhile release because this is such a classic album. I think a lot of folks would love to have this in, you know, whatever format they could get that actually sounds good. And so in this case, stereo, if that's what Kraft and VMP is making available, I do think it's a worthwhile purchase. You know, this is one of those that if you're going to try to find an original, you're probably going to have difficulty finding it in decent shape because it is such a sort of noteworthy album. But, you know, for me, it does come across as a little bit more of a live sounding session. And I think it's because the microphones are further away from the musicians. And I don't, you know, not to say that that's necessarily how it would be in a live setting at the time, although probably more likely that the microphones would be further away rather than each individual mic'd on stage in a live setting. And so what's interesting is that I believe that the next stereo release that Riverside put out was the following year with Pepper Adams' 10-4 at the 5 spot, which is a live session. So kind of interesting, I guess, that the first title, even though it's studio, sounds live. The second title they put out is live. And, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Monk live, actually, for me, is some of his best stuff. I think because he was less inhibited, there was less sort of production around it. Yeah, so I personally think this sounds great. I know that there's a lot of purists that think that the mono is the only way to hear it. And yet all the feedback that I've been hearing online, in terms of reviews and everything, call this release fantastic. They just absolutely love it. And so I think, you know, this may be one of those situations where there's a little bit of a gap between purists who are very familiar with this record versus people who are maybe just now discovering it for the first time or rediscovering it and hearing this presentation where you don't have the noise floor. It sounds clean. There is, you know, a lot of sort of dynamic elements, especially with the horns and piano. So I think that there's enough here to make this a worthwhile release. So I hope this was a helpful discussion for anybody considering picking this up. As always, hit subscribe, hit like, and I'll see you next time.